Welcome to the channel. This is a place where we explore knowledge, improve ourselves, and learn something new every single day. Whether you're here to gain skills, discover ideas, or grow personally, you're in the right spot. Make sure to subscribe so we can learn and grow together.
I spent 22 years building something I was proud of. Not just the firm, but the life around it. A beautiful home in Naperville. A son who made me laugh harder than anyone I'd ever met. A marriage that other couples pointed to when they needed an example of how it was supposed to work. And a business partnership with the man who had been my closest friend since we were 19 years old, sharing a dorm room at the University of Illinois and arguing about everything from architecture to football. We had built Callaway and Marsh Design from 2 desks in a rented basement to a 40-person firm with projects across the Midwest. I was Marcus Callaway. He was my partner. And I had no idea that everything around me was a careful, sustained lie. It was a Thursday evening in late October when my world ended. I remember the date because we had just wrapped a walkthrough on the Riverside Commons project, a mixed-use development that was the biggest contract we had ever landed. I was in a good mood, the kind of mood where you stop for a moment and think, this is it. This is the life you are supposed to have. My son had a soccer game the next morning. My wife had made reservations at the Italian place we both loved. My partner and I had shaken hands in the parking garage and said we'd earned a good weekend. I forgot my laptop bag. I was already 3 blocks away when I realized it, so I turned around and went back up to the office. The building was mostly empty by then, just the cleaning crew on the lower floors and a few lights still burning on our floor. I used my key card at the side entrance, took the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator, and walked down the hall toward my office. The glass-walled conference room near the end of the hall still had its lights on, and as I got closer I heard voices. I almost called out. I almost knocked on the glass and made a joke about working late. Instead, something made me slow down. A tone in my wife's voice that I had never heard before. Something between fear and intimacy. Something that didn't belong in that room at that hour with whoever she was talking to. I stopped just outside the door, back against the wall, and I listened. She was talking to my best friend. I heard her say that she was worried I was starting to notice something. She used my name, Marcus, in that flat, practical way you use someone's name when they've become a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be loved. My partner told her to relax, that I never noticed anything I wasn't looking directly at. She laughed at that. She actually laughed. Then he said something that turned my legs to concrete. He said, "By the time the Riverside disbursement clears, we'll have enough to move without any of this blowing back on us. Just keep him happy for 3 more months." I stood there for what felt like a very long time, long enough to understand, in the slow and terrible way that real understanding works, that I was not listening to 2 colleagues having an after-hours conversation. Long enough to understand that the word us in that sentence did not include me. Long enough to understand that 3 more months meant there was a clock running somewhere that I hadn't known about, counting down to something I hadn't been told. I walked back down the hall. I took the stairs. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 45 minutes and did not move. I want to be honest about what those 45 minutes felt like because people who haven't been through something like this sometimes imagine it's mostly anger. It isn't, not at first. At first, it's just a complete stillness. Like every system in you shuts down to conserve power for whatever comes next. I thought about my son. I thought about the morning 12 years ago when my partner had given a toast at my wedding and made everyone in the room cry, including himself. I thought about how my wife had held my hand in the hospital the night my father died, and how I had been grateful for her in a way that felt permanent. I thought about all the Fridays my partner and I had stayed late in the office going over plans, and how I had never once questioned whether the man across the table from me was something other than what he said he was. Then I drove to a gas station 2 miles away, sat under the fluorescent lights, and started thinking. I am an architect. My whole professional life is about solving problems before they become disasters. You do not react to a structural flaw with panic. You assess, you document, you plan. I made myself think about what I'd actually heard versus what I was inferring. He had said, by the time the Riverside disbursement clears. The Riverside Commons project. Our biggest contract. The disbursement was scheduled for January, which was exactly 3 months away. Enough to move. Move where? Move how? Without any of this blowing back. Any of what? I called my attorney. He was a friend from college, one of the few people I trusted completely, and he had handled all of our corporate legal work for years. He picked up on the 3rd ring, heard the flatness in my voice, and said he'd meet me wherever I needed. We sat in the back booth of a diner until midnight. I told him everything I had heard, word for word, because I had repeated it to myself so many times in the car that it was scored into me. He didn't say anything for a long time after I finished. Then he asked me one question. How much access did my wife have to the firm's accounts? The answer was total. She had been our financial director for 9 years. He told me not to do anything. Don't confront, don't change your behavior, don't move any money, don't say a word to anyone at the office. He said he needed to make some calls first thing in the morning and that I should go home and act like nothing had happened. I have never in my life done anything harder than walking into my own house that night, sitting down to a late dinner my wife had kept warm for me, and talking about my son's soccer game. The next week was a performance I gave 24 hours a day. I went to work and laughed at my partner's jokes. I sat across from my wife at dinner and asked about her day. I coached my son's Saturday practice and stood on the sideline next to the man who had been building a life with my wife while I was standing right there, and I did not let anything show on my face. My son noticed something was wrong on Sunday evening. He was 14 and perceptive in the way that kids that age can be, picking up on frequencies adults think they're hiding. He asked me if I was okay. I told him I was just tired from the project. He looked at me for a second longer than I expected, then went back to his homework, and I loved him so much in that moment that it physically hurt. My attorney moved fast. He brought in a forensic accountant who had worked on fraud cases for 15 years, and within 4 days she had found what she was looking for. My wife had been systematically skimming disbursements for just under 3 years, small enough amounts on each transaction that the quarterly reviews never flagged them, routed through a vendor account that existed on paper but had never provided a single service. The total, as of that week, was just over $400,000. The Riverside disbursement, our largest single payment, scheduled for January, would have added another $160,000. My partner had been the one to set up the vendor account, using an email address and an LLC that traced back to a mailbox in Arizona. My attorney sat across from me in his office and laid it out in plain language. Wire fraud. Breach of fiduciary duty. Depending on how the LLC was structured, potentially federal charges. He said I needed to make some decisions about how I wanted to proceed before we went any further, because once we started certain processes, there was no reversing them. I sat there for a minute. Then I said, all of it. I want all of it. What I didn't say was the other thing I was carrying, the part that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with the Thursday night in the conference room and the way my wife had laughed. I needed to know how long. I needed to know whether the 14 years of my marriage had been what I thought they were, or whether they had been something else entirely. I didn't ask the forensic accountant that question. I hired a separate investigator, a quiet, methodical woman who gave me her report 10 days later with the kind of professional neutrality that I was grateful for, because I don't think I could have sat in a room with someone who showed pity while I read it. 3 years. That was how long the investigator could document, but she said the pattern of behavior suggested it had likely started earlier, possibly as far back as 5 years ago, around the time my partner had gone through his divorce. I want to tell you that I handled that information with the same discipline I had been applying to everything else. I didn't. I sat in my car in the parking structure of my attorney's building, and I cried for 40 minutes in a way I hadn't cried since my father died. Then I washed my face with a bottle of water I had in the cup holder, and I drove to pick up my son from soccer practice, and I decided that it was time to tell him. I took him to his favorite burger place. We sat in a corner booth and he ate half his food before he looked up and said, "Okay, what's actually going on?" I told him I needed him to listen to everything before he said anything, and he nodded, and I told him, not every detail. He was 14, not a business partner, but the truth, in the way a kid deserves to hear it directly, without softening it into something unrecognizable. He didn't say anything for a long time. He stared at the table. Then he asked me if I had known. I said no. He asked me if I was sure. I said I was. He was quiet for another minute, and then he looked up and said, "Are we going to be okay?" I told him yes. He nodded slowly like he was filing that away somewhere, and then he said, "What do we do now?" That was the moment I understood I had raised someone remarkable. I told him we needed to be patient for a little while longer. We needed to act normal, go through the motions, not let either of them see anything coming. He asked if he could be there when I confronted his mother. I told him I'd think about it. He said, "I want her to have to look at me when she explains it." I didn't argue with him. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went to work every day and sat in meetings with the man who had been my best friend for 25 years and who was planning to steal from me and disappear, and I was professional, and I was pleasant, and sometimes I even found myself genuinely laughing at something he said, which disturbed me more than anything else. My wife made dinner. My son played soccer. I reviewed the evidence with my attorney every few days and watched the case get tighter and more complete. My attorney filed the civil complaint on a Wednesday. We had coordinated with the district attorney's office, and the DA's investigator had reviewed everything and was prepared to move on the criminal charges simultaneously. My attorney had arranged for the partnership dissolution papers to be ready. A locksmith would be at the office at 7 in the morning to change the codes to the server room and the main filing systems. A corporate restructuring attorney had already drafted the documents to convert my partnership share into full ownership of the firm. The night before, I sat on the back porch with my son, and we didn't say much. He asked me if I was nervous. I said I wasn't nervous so much as sad. He asked me what I was sad about. I said I was sad about the years I thought I'd had that turned out to be something different. He thought about that for a while, then said, "The years were real, Dad. You just didn't know everything about them." I told him he sounded like a fortune cookie. He said at least he wasn't wrong. We went inside and I slept better than I had in a month. The confrontation with my wife happened in our kitchen on a Thursday morning. My son was home. He had asked to be, and I had agreed, because I thought he had earned that. My partner was being served at the same moment by my attorney's process server. I had timed it that way deliberately. She came downstairs, and I was already at the kitchen table. My son was sitting against the counter with his arms crossed. She looked at him, then at me, and she knew. I could see it happen on her face. The shift from the expression she'd worn every morning for years into something much more naked and afraid. I told her to sit down. She said my name like a question. I told her again, more quietly, to sit down. I put the forensic accountant's summary on the table. I put a printed copy of the wire transfer records next to it. I put the investigator's report in front of her face down, and I told her I'd let her read it if she wanted confirmation. But I didn't think she needed it. She started crying before she said anything. She said it wasn't what it looked like. I asked her what it looked like, then, because I was curious what explanation would make $400,000 in fraudulent transfers in 5 years with my best friend into something other than what they were. She said she had made mistakes. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't know how it had gotten this far. My son said, from the counter in a voice that was very controlled for a 14-year-old, "How long did you think you could keep this going?" She looked at him and started to say something, and he shook his head. He said, "Don't lie to me right now. I'm asking a real question." She told him it had been going on for about 4 years. My son looked at me and I could see him calculating something. He had been 10 when it started. I thought about all the things that had happened in those 4 years. His first year of middle school, my father's death. The year we had taken a family trip to Colorado and hiked in Rocky Mountain National Park, and she had photographed all of us at the summit with the mountains behind us. 4 years of that, running underneath. I told her that our attorney would be in contact with her attorney, and that I had already arranged for someone to bring her things to her sister's house. I told her she needed to be out by the end of the day. I told her the criminal matter was no longer something I could help her with or protect her from, because I had already spoken to the district attorney's office, and that was proceeding on its own now. She asked me if there was any chance we could try to repair things. I told her no, not because I was angry, although I was, but because the person I would have needed to repair things with did not exist. I had been in a marriage with a version of her that had been, at least partially, a performance. You cannot repair something with a person you cannot trust exists. She wept. She asked about our son. I told her that our son would be staying with me and that a family law attorney would handle the rest. She asked if she could talk to him alone. He answered before I could. He said, "Not today." She flinched. She looked at me one more time, and I looked back at her. And I think we were both taking stock of something. The full weight of 23 years, and what it had become, and what it was ending as. Her sister arrived an hour later. My son and I sat in a living room and listened to her move through the house, the sound of drawers opening and closets being emptied. When the door finally closed behind her, he let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it for weeks. My partner's confrontation was less quiet. He showed up at the office that afternoon despite being served. He came in through the front entrance like it was any other day, and when he found me in what had been our shared conference room with my attorney, the restructuring attorney, and the 2 representatives from the DA's office, he stood in the doorway and I watched the realization move across his face. He said my name, not as a question, as an accusation. I told him the partnership was being dissolved effective immediately. I told him the criminal charges would be formally filed the next morning. I told him the firm's accounts were frozen pending the investigation, and that anything he attempted to transfer or access from this point forward would be considered an additional count of fraud. He said I had no idea what I was doing. He said I was throwing away 25 years. I told him he'd done that 3 years ago, possibly 5. I told him I was just finally catching up. He tried to get to his computer. The IT consultant I had hired the week before had already imaged the hard drives and changed the passwords. He tried his key card on the server room and it didn't work. He stood in the middle of the office we had built together and looked around at it like he was trying to find something to hold on to, and there was nothing. He left without being escorted out, which I gave him credit for, but he was arrested at his condo that evening, which my attorney told me about the next morning over the phone with the professional neutrality of someone delivering a weather report. The legal process took about 8 months. My partner pled guilty to wire fraud and embezzlement to avoid trial and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. The money was largely recovered, minus legal fees. My wife faced her own charges, negotiated a plea that resulted in probation and full restitution, and agreed to the divorce terms without contesting custody, which was the outcome I had needed most. My son remained with me. My attorney, Angela, later told me it was one of the cleaner custody resolutions she'd seen in a fraud-adjacent divorce, which is a strange thing to feel relieved about, but I did. Rebuilding the firm took about 18 months. I brought in a new partner, a structural engineer I'd worked with on 3 projects over the years, someone with no overlap with the old history. I promoted my office manager, a steady, sharp woman named Joanna, who had been with the firm for 11 years and who had, it turned out, noticed inconsistencies in the vendor account 2 years earlier but hadn't known who to bring it to. I made her our COO. She was better at the operational side than I had been, and the firm was better for it within a year. My son thrived in ways that surprised me, losing the version of his family he'd thought he had hurt him. I won't minimize that, but there was something about the whole experience that seemed to clarify things for him. He became more direct, more decisive. He started to understand, at 14 and 15, that the people you build your life around need to be people who can bear examination. He said that to me once, almost exactly in those words, and I had to pretend I needed to look at something in the other direction for a moment. His mother and I eventually settled into a kind of distant, functional coexistence. He chose to spend time with her on his own terms, gradually, over the course of about 2 years. I didn't push him in either direction. She had moved about 40 minutes away and found work with a nonprofit in the city. She reached out to me once, about a year after the divorce was final, to say she knew she couldn't explain or justify what she had done and wasn't asking me to understand it. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because there wasn't anything useful to say. Joanna and I had dinner for the first time outside of a work context about a year and a half after the restructuring. It was unremarkable in the best possible way. We talked for 3 hours and I couldn't tell you exactly what about, because it was one of those conversations that moves through everything without needing to announce itself. She told me later that she had thought about saying something for over a year, but hadn't known where the line was. I told her I was glad she'd eventually crossed it. We were married 2 years later, in the backyard of a house we had bought together in a neighborhood about 12 miles from where I used to live. My son walked me down whatever the equivalent is for a father at a second wedding, which involved him mostly making jokes under his breath and occasionally squeezing my arm when he thought I looked like I needed it. Joanna's family came in from Portland in Minnesota, and my son spent an hour talking to her younger brother about soccer tactics, and at some point during the reception, I looked across the yard and watched my son laugh at something her brother said, and I thought about all the configurations a family can take. 10 years after that Thursday evening in the parking garage, my son graduated from law school at Northwestern. He had gone into corporate law with a specialty in white-collar fraud, which he had told me when he chose his concentration was entirely my fault. I told him I would take that as a compliment. He said that was probably the right call. At the graduation dinner, when it was just Joanna and my son and me and Joanna's mother and my son's girlfriend, who was now his fiancée, he gave a short toast. He said that the thing he had learned from watching me go through what I went through was that the worst thing that can happen to you and the best thing that can happen to you are sometimes the same event, and that the difference between them is entirely what you do next. He looked at me when he said it. I have thought about my former partner a few times over the years in the way you think about something that has become historical. He was released after serving a little over 4 years. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he had moved to another state and was doing some kind of consulting work. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. There is a version of this story where I feel something for him beyond what I actually feel, which is an almost complete absence. Not hatred, Not forgiveness exactly. Just the natural result of someone being removed from your life so thoroughly that the space they occupied eventually closes over. 25 years of friendship, and this is what it came to. I used to think that was the saddest part of the whole thing. Now I think the saddest part was that he had a choice, every single day for years, to be the person I thought he was. He just kept choosing not to. My former partner spent years of his life building something alongside me with one hand and dismantling it with the other. He lost everything he'd taken and then some. He's a footnote now in a story that turned out, despite him, to be about something else entirely. Joanna is asleep in the next room. My son is getting married in the spring. Callaway Design. I dropped the ampersand and the second name the day the restructuring was complete, has projects in 7 states. I run it the same way I always ran it, carefully, transparently, with people I trust at every level. I am 51 years old. My life is not what I thought it would be when I was 29 and starting a firm with my best friend and marrying the woman I thought I knew. It is in almost every way that matters better. Not because what happened was good. It wasn't. But because what I built afterward was real in a way the first version never quite was. My son was right. The years were real. I just didn't know everything about them. And the years since have been even more real, because now I know exactly who I'm living them with.